Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Josh Phillips. This is my second YouTube lecture. The first one was on the U.S. Constitution. Today we are going to be talking about John Stuart Mill, his book on liberty, and we're going to be looking at it through what Heterodox Academy put out a shorter version of it called All-1. I'm going to put the link to the packet. If you Google search Heterodox Academy All-1, you're going to find it. It's a short 50-page graphic novel that summarizes what I believe is chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill's 3 main reasons as to why you should be listening to other ideas. My last video on the U.S. Constitution was close to an hour. This one I'm going to do my best to get through in 20 minutes, so I might be moving a little bit quicker, but there's a lot of information on these PowerPoints, and you can sort of pause and take notes as you need. All right. John Stuart Mill, this is how long he lived, 1806 to 1873. In 1859, he wrote this sort of short book, very long essay, we can call it. It's called On Liberty. And what he was interested in was this issue of free speech. Now, a lot of people think that it was some sort of elaboration on the First Amendment to the Constitution. That was not his motivation. He was concerned about government censorship, but he was more concerned about self-censorship and conformity. So whether or not there's a First Amendment that protects speech, John Stuart Mill said we should foster a community that welcomes free and open debate because it's actually good for all of us. So this wasn't necessarily a legal argument. This was more of a social contract argument that he was making. His main point was that we need each other. So how do we know what our opinions are? How do we know if our opinions are correct if we haven't heard all sides of the issue? This is what happens when we end up in these echo chambers. If we think about social media, if I'm on Twitter and I'm only following people who already agree with me, I don't really know if I actually believe that or not because I haven't heard any other viewpoints. If I sit on, if I'm watching cable news every night and I just watch MSNBC for 4 hours every night during prime time, I'm not really sure if I agree with MSNBC or if I agree with the other side because I haven't heard the totality of the issue. A good example of this to think of as college student is, do you want free higher education, which means you don't pay any tuition? It might be really easy because you're in college, you're the one paying the bills, to sit around with all your classmates and say, yeah, that's a great idea. My big question to you all is, okay, well, why do some people oppose it, right? And what are the good arguments, right? We'll get down to this in a second. How can your opinion have any strength if it hasn't been tested against strong opposing arguments? So sometimes when people make arguments or try to imagine what the other side is going to say, they make these caricatures of their opponent. They pick the worst debaters, they pick the worst arguments, they pick the people who are on the very far left or on the very far right, and they say, well, I'm going to debate these people. Those people are very easy to debate because their ideas on the fringes are pretty Looney Tune. All right. So I like to compare this to athletics. If you're an athlete, you don't want to practice against, if you're a high school athlete, you don't want to practice against a 4th grader who's 4 feet tall if you're a basketball player, right? That's not going to make you any better. So quit debating people who on the other side who are, not viable opponents, all right? Go up and try to find those people who disagree with you, who are actually intelligent on their side, who actually know what they're talking about, who are very, very good at debating. Those are the people who are going to help you sharpen your debate skills. The same way that if you want to get better at basketball, go challenge people who are a little bit better than you at basketball. All right? So that's what John Stuart Mill is sort of putting out here, is that in order to sort of make sure that your debate is correct and your arguments are correct, go find people who disagree with you, who are good opponents. So he has 3 main points he makes, and this is how the All-1 pamphlet that Heterodox Academy put out, this is how it's laid out. His first position is that the other opinion might be true. So one of the reasons we want free and open debate is because we're not always correct, right? And this was the attitude of Socrates. Socrates says that he knows he was wise because he knew that he didn't know everything. He was open to the possibility of being wrong. History is filled with tyrannical suppression of ideas, and we are all the worst for it. And the reason that we're worst for it is because if we have these sort of powerful people who constantly squash our speech down, if my speech is correct, then what happens is that we've sort of retarded progress when it comes to making sure we have the best ideas. Think about how much science has been held back because people said we don't want those scientific books out there. We don't want to talk about, heliocentric versus an a geocentric universe. We don't want to talk about creationism and intelligent design and evolution. Those things are kind of off the table. When people suppress speech, they might be correct, but if we kind of keep tamping them down, then we actually slow down the progress that we can make as human beings. This becomes a question of epistemology. Epistemology is a fascinating subject, and what it is looking for is how do we cultivate knowledge? Where does knowledge come from? How do we know what is true or not true? And again, if you sit in an echo chamber all day, and let's say I watch Fox News all day, I might say Donald Trump's a great president, Donald Trump's a great president, and people say, well, how do you know that? And I say, well, I watch Fox News every day. Well, I'm only getting one perspective of the issue, right? And the other side might be true, and so it's important for me to sort of collect all the information, all the data from all sides of the issue. So you have to ask yourself these epistemological questions when it comes to how is it that you know what it is you know, right? Where's your information from? Are you making sure? Are you making an effort to gather all the facts before you put out a position? This comes to the idea of critical thinking. What I cannot stress enough when it comes to college students is that people think critical thinking and critical theory are the same thing. They are not the same thing. Get them away from each other. Critical theory is about issues of putting things in perspectives of power. It's all about tearing down hierarchies. That is not critical thinking. This is how I like to define critical thinking. All right. First and foremost, it's about thinking, which means it happens inside your own head. You don't need other people for this at the moment. And what it is that is an internal debate. It's a rigorous internal debate with yourself on a specific issue, right? Which means that you need to know both sides of the issue. So if you're going to sit there and say, you know what, I want to have a debate with myself. I want to think critically about the issue of gun control. You don't sit there and just like tear down the other side and say, this is why the other side, oh, look, I'm being critical of the NRA. That's not critical thinking, right? Critical thinking is, okay, I want to be a critical thinker about gun control. What I need to do is I need to go out and I need to learn all the information I can about pro-gun Second Amendment stuff. I need to learn all the information I can about why we need to curb the sale of guns or the access to guns, right? And I'm rigorously thinking through the issue by consuming as much information as I can on that particular issue, all right? So it's an internal debate with yourself. You need, in order to be a critical thinker, you need a lot of this. Knowledge. You need a lot of knowledge. You cannot be a critical thinker if you don't know anything. A lot of people out there, they have a lot of opinions about a lot of stuff, and what we realize is that they actually don't know much about anything. Now, here's the truth of the matter, is most of us, including people with PhDs, we don't know that much about that many topics, right? Most people, right, just for the sake of time, right, are pretty ignorant on the vast majority of issues, right? I have a PhD, which means that I'm pretty intelligent on one very narrow, specific field, right? That's all that means, right? I have a lot of knowledge about one issue, but that doesn't mean that I have a lot of knowledge on a ton of things. And this is what's kind of fascinating to me in the age of social media. So if we think about the last 2 years or so, quick little example. When Donald Trump and the Republicans passed tax reform, all of a sudden, this was a couple years ago, all of a sudden everybody gets on Twitter and all of a sudden everybody's an economist. And they're like, oh, I know everything about tax reform. No, you don't. We're all just people on Twitter thinking we have an opinion about, the tax code, when most of us don't know anything about it, right? Then a couple months later, and all right, we get to February of this year, March of 2020, and the coronavirus hits. Coronavirus hits, and all of a sudden, guess what happens? Everyone jumps on Twitter and on Facebook, and everybody's an expert, communicable disease doctor. You should wear a mask. You shouldn't wear a mask. You should go out. You shouldn't go out. It's infectious. It's not infectious. It's like the flu. It's not. Everybody has all these opinions, and the truth of the matter is, most of us, we know nothing about it, right? But we spout off we spout off at the mouth, acting like we do. But the thing is that we just sort of say these things without actually reading the literature. Move a couple months after the COVID set in, and then we have this unfortunate situation in Minnesota with the death of George Floyd. Right? Everybody sees a 9-minute clip, and all of a sudden everybody's a complete expert on police tactics and police brutality and racism in America and the history of the civil rights and all this other kind of stuff. And the fact of the matter is not many of us know anything about the criminal justice system or policing, right? We follow certain people on Twitter, and then we just sort of echo chamber it out, right? This person that I like on the news said the following, and I'm just going to parrot whatever that person said, right? Most of us know nothing about crime statistics. Most of us know nothing about how many people are shot, not shot, armed, unarmed, with regard to police shootings every year. When it comes to arresting tactics, right? When the police get aggressive with people they're trying to arrest, most of us know nothing about things like chokeholds. We also saw that horrible video, right, of the police officer with his knee on the back and on the neck of George Floyd. Everybody jumps online. Everybody all of a sudden is a combat sport expert about what's legal and what's not legal and what's a chokehold and what's this and what that. And the fact of the matter is, most of us just need to pause and say, you know what? I don't know. It looks bad. It looks terrible, right? Hope something gets done because of it, but we're not experts on it. All right? So you have to have a lot of knowledge on a subject before you opine on it. And if you want to be a critical thinker, you have to learn about both sides of the issue, right? You can't just go out there and read a bunch of stuff you already agree with. The government, right? If we're talking about the government, this goes back to our discussion on the Constitution. If you want to have an opinion on the government, right? You probably have an opinion about the upcoming election in November of 2020 here, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. If you want to have an opinion about the government and how the government should work, you should go back to that lecture on the Constitution, and you should be able to answer basic questions of, okay, what are the branches of the government? How many are there? What is the function of each branch? All right? You should be able to answer that simple question if you want to opine on whether or not you think the government should be, one way or another, whether or not we should vote for Democrats, whether or not we should vote for Republicans, what policies we should put in place. You should know what it is that you're talking about. If you want to talk about sort of how the whole system works, right, you should know basic things like, okay, who's the president, who's the vice president, who's the speaker of the House, the leader of the Senate, what's the number of Congress representatives, et cetera, right? Again, if you do not like the system, right, a lot of people are out there in the streets right now protesting the system. You want to protest? That's not my business in the classroom to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. But what I can tell you is that you should have basic understanding of how the system is set up. Right? Don't just go out there and say, I'm going to tear down the system and have no understanding of how the system is set up, why the system is set up that way, what you're going to replace the system with. You should have lots and lots of knowledge about the current system with regard to how it's set up and how it operates before you just go out there and protest the system. You should know what federalism is, right? Which is the ways in which our local, state, and national government interact with each other. You should know the difference between positive and negative rights, which is something we went over with the Constitution PowerPoint. And then you should be able to name and understand several of the 27 amendments. How does an amendment become an amendment? How do we change laws? What's the difference between a law and an amendment? What's the difference between a law and an amendment and an executive order, right? These are all basic government things. And again, I'm not saying the government's perfect, right? But if you're a person who wants to change the system, you should know basic things about the system. Some more examples. Do you have an opinion about Donald Trump? Of course you do. Everybody does, right? And they're pretty there's no real middle ground on the president. People love him or people don't love him, to be polite. All right. However, if you're in my classroom, these are some simple questions I'm going to ask you about the man. All right. If you have an opinion about Donald Trump, you can't just have an opinion because you watch Sean Hannity every night and you're like, Donald Trump's the second coming of Jesus, right? You can't just watch Rachel Maddow every night and say Donald Trump's the Antichrist, right? If you want to be an intelligent a person who wants to engage in intelligent conversations, especially in my classroom, right, with me, these are some questions I'm going to ask you if you want to give a speech on why Donald Trump is awesome or Donald Trump is not awesome, all right? So I'm going to ask you things like, okay, what's his tax policy? What are some basic functions of the president as far as the plans and policies he puts out? Okay, you don't like Donald Trump and the tax policy that he signed into law created by the Republican Congress. Fine. What is it? Can you explain the tax policy to me? If you tell me you don't like it, I'm going to need an explanation of just like, can you define what policy it is you're talking about? You can't just say it's bad because you dislike Donald Trump. That's what we call an ad hominem attack, right? I'm attacking the person. I'm not attacking the policy. So just explain the policy to me, right? What is the United States tax policy? How much money in taxes does the average U.S. citizen pay every year, right? What does a progressive income tax mean? How many tax brackets are there? Right? These are very, very simple, basic things with regard to the tax policy that you should be able to answer before you want to engage in a conversation about tax policy. I got into an argument, a friendly argument. This is a friend of mine, so her and I argue about political things all the time. And she, in 2016, she supported Bernie Sanders for president. Fantastic. You want to vote for Bernie? Great. Right? But she was talking about his tax policy, and she's like, she said, this is what we need to do. We need to raise them, the taxes on wealthy individuals, et cetera. And I don't have an opinion one way or another, right? But my simple question to her is, okay, if you are a person who makes over $1 million, right, which is kind of the cutoff, the generic cutoff for people who are considered wealthy as far as making money, I was like, how much do those individuals currently pay in taxes every year? And her response was, I don't know, I don't look at the numbers. Right? And she was genuine about this, right? I have no problem if you want to raise taxes on people or you want to cut taxes on people, but you should be able to explain what the current tax system is before you engage in these conversations. All right? Be a critical thinker. Don't be an echo chamber person who just repeats talking points off of cable news. What's Donald Trump's minimum wage policy? All right? If you want to have an opinion on that, great. We're going to skip this for a second because I'm going to come back. What's his trade policy? If you don't like the way that he's dealing with foreign companies and foreign countries, great. What's his policy in the first place? All right, you need to be able to give basic definitions of this stuff. When it comes to education, what's his policy on public and private schools, on vouchers, on teachers unions, and the like? All right, if you don't like his stance on education, you don't like his education secretary, Betsy DeVos, fine. All right, but just be able to tell me the basic stuff that they have on paper on policy. Again, not the stuff that you heard from the news third hand, but actually what is on paper, what is their stated policy. Essentially, I'm asking you, don't just resist everything. Don't just sort of like have ad hominem attacks against, either President Trump or any other political figure, right? If you like Joe Biden's tax policy, great. Explain to me what it is. If you want to vote for Joe Biden for president because you like his immigration policy better, great. Explain to me what it is. Have that knowledge. A quick story on Donald Trump and his immigration policy. I did this exercise in my class a couple years ago when Donald Trump signed the executive order on the issue of immigration when we banned, we as a country, banned immigrants coming in from 7 different countries. I think it eventually was scaled back to 6 different countries. And my students, they were all sort of caught up with it. We're close to Philadelphia Airport. I had lots of friends and colleagues who were at the Philadelphia Airport protesting this immigration ban that Donald Trump had signed. It's sometimes referred to as the Muslim ban, immigration ban. All right. So I poll my students, in the semester after this, and I just ask my students, okay, how many of you heard of this executive order? And all of them raise their hand, and I say, okay, how many of you, and I don't ask for their opinions, I just say, how many of you had an opinion, whether you liked it or didn't like it? They don't need to tell me if they liked it or didn't. All of them raise their hands, right? And then my next question to them is a pretty obvious one, right? How many of you read it? And everybody's hand goes down, right? And again, we get to this point, as citizens, as students, as academics, where we say, I have a strong opinion, right, about an executive order that President Trump signed, and a very basic question of how many of you read it, everybody's hand go down because nobody read it, right? Then I let them know, here he is, he's holding this is him actually holding the bill, or the executive order, excuse me. And I tell him, it's a page and a half long. It's a page and a half long. It'll take you 10, maybe 20 minutes tops to read the entire thing, right? But again, we're caught up in this whole idea of, I want to have an opinion, but I don't want to actually do the hard work to cultivate the knowledge in order to sort of formulate my own opinion. I'm just going to listen to what Fox News told me to say or what MSNBC told me to say. If you like or dislike the president, I am unconcerned on that, right? I only care that you are informed about policies and that you can articulate and summarize those policies, right? And the same thing is true of, if you're going to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the fall. Great, all right? But if you want to tell me that their policies are better, I'm going to need you to articulate to me what are their policies. A good little rule that I try to follow on my own and I tell my students about is before every presidential election, one thing that I try to do with all of the sort of top tier candidates that are kind of maybe sneaking in for the nomination process is I try to read a book that they wrote. So this kind of started with me back in 2008, reading both of then Senator, but eventually President Obama's books. Read John McCain. John McCain has some books out there. In 2012, Newt Gingrich, Mitt Romney, Ron Paul were sort of near the top of the process. So I read that. I read some Donald Trump stuff in 2016, some Hillary Clinton stuff, right? And now I need to read some Joe Biden stuff because he's going to be, on the top of the ticket, right? I don't know if Kamala Harris has a book, but if she does, I'll read that too, all right, before the election. This is just a way for me to, genuinely sort of practice what I preach with my students, right? I don't want to go around telling people you need to be informed on all sides of the issue, and then my students say, who did you vote for? Did you even look at the other person's policies? All right? So that's all I'm asking you to do. If you don't like Donald Trump's immigration policy, fine. But tell me, how many people can enter the U.S. every year? What are our current immigration numbers? How many people are currently in the country legally and illegally? And what's the difference between green cards and visas and, DACA? Can you explain this? Like, just very simple stuff you should be able to explain to someone before you go out there and just spout off an opinion, right? And it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know those items, but I'm also going to expect you to say, like, I don't know what I'm talking about yet, so I'm just going to go and I'm going to do my research, and then I'll come back with an informed opinion. That's perfectly acceptable. Too often people are like, I have to be the first one to tweet it out, as opposed to saying, I need to pause for a moment, and I'm not going to go engage with it until I actually learn about it, all right? Good academics require some humility and some patience, as we saw with Socrates and Plato's Apology. Quickly, do you have an opinion on Shakespeare? So this is some academic stuff. If you're a person who goes around and says, look, Shakespeare is this old, antiquated, dead white guy, right? Why are we reading him? He's sort of hiding behind my camera right here. Here's some articles from Slate.com as well as Reason.com about different English departments, art departments sort of getting rid of these sort of traditional Western canonical works of art as requirements. They're still taught as electives, but they're not necessarily required. So this one is University of California, LA. They eliminated Shakespeare as a requirement. Students can still take it as an elective, but they aren't required to take it in order to obtain an English degree, right? So this is at UCLA. They took down William Shakespeare's portrait. It was at the top of the staircase, and they replaced it with this woman right here, Audre Lorde, who I've read plenty of Audre Lorde, right? Nothing against people. If you want to read Audre Lorde in college, take a class, Black Feminist Thought, fantastic, right? And you make a list for you with her and Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks, and I'd probably even throw Alice Walker in there. Alice Walker, more fiction writer as opposed to nonfiction theoretical stuff, but still, all right? So you should read all these things. Okay. However, when students go around and say, we don't want to read Shakespeare, get all this dead white man stuff out of our syllabus, what is probably my first question to these students? All right. These are all valid points. Fine. But first I'm going to ask them, all right, have you ever read Shakespeare? All right. Why is it that there are so many people who go around and pontificate on the usefulness of Shakespeare who haven't read Shakespeare? Right? So I want them to go around and I would say, look, do you understand his importance in the last 500 years of shaping cultural narratives, specifically shaping cultural narratives about the human condition in Western civilization? So much of our books and our movies and our stories, right, our tradition of storytelling, our tradition of engaging with family relationships and romantic relationships, right, understanding political engagement, right, comes out of the work of Shakespeare. But when people say, look, I don't want to read Shakespeare because I know that he's a dead white guy from 500 years ago, that's an extremely ignorant statement. Because if you want to critique him, fine. If you want to read all of Shakespeare and then say, look, now I think that we shouldn't have to read it anymore, right? If I'm in charge of UCL's English department, their English department, do whatever they want. But if you want to read through all of Shakespeare's work and then say, okay, now I can have an informed opinion as to whether or not we should be requiring Shakespeare, right, or Audre Lorde, fine. But don't go around and say we need to strip all this stuff out of the syllabus, out of the core curricula, right, before you've actually read it and engaged with it, right? Again, you cannot be a critical thinker if you do not consume the material, right? So again, there's a difference between critical theory and critical thinking. Critical theory is like, let's get rid of these hierarchies, let's replace old systems with new systems. That's not critical thinking. Critical thinking is done a lot by yourself in your house in this sort of quiet solitude of just consuming massive amounts of books. That's what critical thinking requires, right? It's not loud, it's not fancy, it's not sexy, it's not, protesting on the streets, right? It's just you in your house by yourself, like trying to read an average of one book a week if you're lucky. Right? So you want to critique Shakespeare, fine, but you first got to read him and understand him. So this is a fun one that I give to my students. right? What 2018 summer blockbuster movie used Shakespeare themes? My students look at me like, what? Shakespeare's still relevant? And I was like, yeah, Shakespeare's relevant. But everybody's sitting here saying, look, it's a dead white guy from 500 years ago, not relevant anymore. And I say, did you watch this movie in 2018 that everybody watched, that everyone was excited about, and I believe won an Oscar in some sort of category, at least was nominated? And they say, oh yeah, I watched a lot of movies. What movies are you talking about, Dr. Phillips? I didn't know Shakespeare was still relevant. And I say, look, it's Black Panther, all right? Black Panther is Shakespearean. Black Panther is Hamlet, all right? So when people watch Black Panther and love Black Panther, right, main character, right, recently passed, right, very sad situation. But I have my students look at this and they say, wow, I didn't know that. Well, of course you didn't know that, right? Nobody taught you Shakespeare. But if you read Shakespeare, if you read Hamlet specifically, and then you watch Black Panther, your entire world can open up. And the reason that this is important is because when you start reading things that are 300, 400, 500 years old, 1,000 years old, right? If you go back to the Bible, if you go back to 1001 Arabian Nights, if you go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, you start reading these old, antiquated books written by all these dead guys, right? All of a sudden you realize like, wow, we're still telling the same stories in the year 2020. This is why reading the canon is so important and having that knowledge is so important, right? It's not because it's like, well, it's been around forever. It's just, it's this old book I don't want to read. When you start reading these older books, you start realizing how these similar themes from thousands of years ago still come up in our literature, still come up in our movies, right? And all of a sudden you have this appreciation of, holy crap, not only do I live in 2020, but I'm connected to Shakespeare 500 years ago. I'm connected to, the works of the Bible from 2,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, right? I'm connected to, 1001 Arabian Nights back in Persia, right? I'm connected to the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? You start realizing like, wow, like all these things that I'm concerned about, all the excitement in my life, love and romance, and like other people thought about those things for thousands of years. All that tragedy that comes with life, the human experience, death and destruction and families being torn apart and divorce and losing a loved one, you're like, wow, other people have been thinking about this stuff too. And this is why consuming these books and these stories is so important. So with Black Panther specifically, and again, it's a story of Hamlet. And I show my students that, this Black Panther, 10 minutes, I went and saw this movie in the theater, I think the second weekend it came out. I was excited like everybody else, right? But 10 minutes in the movie, I was like, oh, I'm watching The Lion King, right? Which is Hamlet, all right? There's a lot of little sort of memes online that sort of show this, right? So over here we have Simba sort of like looking up in the ancestors and the stars, right? And then we have, Black Panther over here doing the same. We even have this sort of like symbolism of Pride Rock. It's this sort of intra-family conflict and murder regarding rights to the throne, right? So over here, it's like Black Panther's fighting his cousin because his cousin's like, it's my throne now. I'm supposed to be the king. And over here you have Simba fighting Scar, right? Because Scar, his uncle. So it's like a cousin versus an uncle. Okay, we separated a cousin and an uncle. But it's the same exact story, right? It's the same exact story where both these people, both of these main characters lose their father and they go into the wilderness and their uncle or cousin take over. The whole system falls apart and their relatives come and say, come back and save the kingdom, right? That's the story of Hamlet, right? That's the story of Black Panther. That's the story of The Lion King. So if you want to get rid of Shakespeare, fine, right? But read him first and realize like, wow, we're still telling the same story. All right, we're still telling the same story 500 years later. And that's why it's important to know these things before you start kicking them out of the academic canon. I think this is the last one, right? So if you have an opinion on something, an economic system, fine, right? Capitalism versus socialism. You want to make an argument for either one? Great. There's plenty of books out there that make good arguments for both, right? But again, I poll my students in my class and I say, okay, who wants to do capitalism? Who wants to do socialism? Fine. And then I ask them simple questions like, can you define the term? What does it mean to be under a socialist system versus a capitalist system? And very few students can even give a simple definition of what these two economic policies look like in practice, right? Can you give me some history about where they've been used, right? Can you give me a little background, right? We're not reinventing the wheel here. Capitalism's been tried before. Socialism's been tried before. They've both been around. Give me a little bit of background. Right? So again, don't just have an opinion. It's like go and read Karl Marx, right? Go and read Friedrich Hayek, right? Go and read Adam Smith. Go and read Milton Friedman, right? It's like go read these economic these sort of like pillars of economic theory, right? And then come back to me and then have a definition on these terms, all right? Example, you can't have a positive view of socialism, for instance, if you can't even define it, okay? So if you just say, well, it just means that we're all social, everybody likes to be social, it's not social. It's like, give me a definition, right? And then defend it, right? And it's fine. I'm totally fine with people defending their position on what they want, capitalism, socialism, communism, whatever, right? But at least be able to define what it means, all right? So have opinions, right? Vote for your candidate of choice, but do not be anti-intellectual. Have enough humility and patience, be like Socrates, to be able to step back and say, you know what? I'm wise because I don't know everything, so maybe I just need to pause for a moment, right? It's okay not to tweet out 5 seconds after some sort of major news event happens and say, I know everything that happened. I know exactly what happened in this, shooting situation or this, this protest situation. It's like, maybe I don't. And maybe I just need to pause for a moment and go and collect multiple sources of information to get a full view of capitalism versus socialism, right? Criminology, statistics, pro-gun, anti-gun. Collect everything. If you want to be an expert in your field on a specific topic, you need to know the whole topic from all perspectives, right? So don't be anti-intellectual, right? Don't sit there and say, I don't need to read books from the other side because I just know better. I don't need to, I watch MSNBC. I don't need to turn on Fox News because I just know that Fox News is, gross and disgusting and awful all the time. And I say, well, how do you know that if you never watched it, right? It's like, watch it every now and again, all right? Stay curious, right? Be agnostic, which means sort of go into things with this attitude of like, I'm going to learn something new when I engage with people who are different than me, when I engage with books that I might disagree with. Sort of go in and just have an open mind, right? And then finally, just read everything. Read everything you get your hands on. My dissertation, for instance, was on homelessness. Guess what? I went to the library, checked out every book I could on homelessness. I didn't care if it was from the right, from the left, from progressives, from conservatives, from wherever. It's like I'm just going to consume as much information because I just wanted to know the entire academic literature on the issue of homelessness and welfare and poverty and welfare reform. I just wanted to know everything, right? So I had to read everything, all right? So that's what you need to do. All right. His second point, and these are shorter slides, right? So the first one is maybe the other person is true. So this is why you want people to be able to speak freely, is because their perspective might be correct. John Stuart Mill, his second point is he who knows only his side of the case knows little of that, right? And we can look at two people here, Cicero and Sun Tzu. So Cicero studied his opponent's side of the argument, and the reason he did that is because he wanted to know how to debate his opponent. If you go into a debate, the best thing that you can do is read everything that your opponent reads, right? Go in there knowing the viewpoint that is in direct conflict with your current viewpoint. If I'm in the Republican debate, I want to go in and I just want to know everything that the Democrats are pushing, right? Or vice versa, all right? The reason Cicero did that is because he's like, look, if I can get out there and people are just going to throw their arguments at me, it's like I've already studied and read their arguments. I know exactly how to offer a counter argument to that. All right. If I only go in knowing my side of the issue, then I don't even know what's going to be thrown at me. So I don't even know if my side of the issue is really correct because I haven't tested it. All right. So we go back to the first slide, and it's like, I don't know if I'm a good basketball player if I haven't gone up against LeBron James, right? It's like you got to test your skills. So that's why he says, even if he doesn't say you know half of the argument if you know your side of the argument. He says you don't even know your own side of the argument yet. If I only know my talking points, I don't even know the reasons I believe what I believe. Right? I just know that I'm supposed to parrot them. If I learn my side and my opponent's side, now in that process I'm testing my side of the argument. And now I can say like, oh, this is why I actually believe these things. In Sun Tzu's The Art of War, he says, if you know your enemy and know yourself, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. So again, what Sun Tzu is saying is like, study your enemy, study the people you disagree with. All right. Again, if you are a Democrat operative, it's like you go out there and you do oppo research. It's like you sit around all day watching Fox News, you read Donald Trump's book, you go through the Republican National Committee platform for going into the 2020 election. It's like that's your job, right? If you are a Democrat who wants to have strong arguments against the Republican establishment, right? Or vice versa. All right. Again, think of athletics. When you have an opponent, it's like you don't sit around and watch your own film, right? you go and you watch your opponent's film. So again, this frustrates me when people want to do things like shut down free speech. I'm like, in every other area of life except for speech on most, it's like we're always studying people who disagree with us, right? We're always studying our opponents, right? If we go into a war situation, right, we don't sit there and study our own military. It's like we're going to go study the people that we're going into war with, right? If you're an athlete, LeBron James doesn't sit around and watch, highlights of himself on YouTube all day. LeBron James sits around and is like, who's my next opponent? I want to see where his weaknesses are. I want to see where he's usually taking a jump shot. I want to see how many dribbles he takes before, he sort of like stops and posts up and he's getting ready to shoot whatever, right? LeBron James is studying his opponent. So when people say things like, I don't want certain people to speak, or I want to disinvite certain speakers to campus, I'm like, why? Because you disagree with them? It's like, I want people to give me those arguments because I want to know where I stand more sufficiently. Finally, you might be correct, but you must know why you are correct, and you want to know how you got there. All right. So again, when people throw arguments at me, I can sort of fish my way through my own argument to better strengthen my argument. I can't do that if people aren't giving me reasons to doubt myself. So go find those difficult opponents. Again, don't find people who are super easy to debate. Don't go find people on the fringe right or the fringe left who are spouting nonsense conspiracy theories. It's like, go find good people, honest people on the left, on the right, who actually are intelligent. Go find those people, and it's like, allow yourself to debate them. Allow yourself to engage with them as far as their arguments are concerned. John Stuart Mill also refers to this idea of dead dogma. So dead dogma essentially means, you learn something once and you no longer study it. So he says that teachers and learners are going to fall asleep. It's a bad idea, right? Because if I learned something when I'm 18 years old in college and then I never study it anymore, how do I know if I'm actually sort of formulating a better idea? Muhammad Ali has this great quote, and I failed to put it up here because I'm an idiot, right? But Muhammad Ali has this quote where he says, "A man who thinks the same at 50 as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life." And I love that quote, right? Are you just going to accept something that you learned at 18 years old and just never change your mind? I hope not, right? Most of us are going to change, political beliefs, religious beliefs, social, cultural beliefs we're going to change them throughout our life. But we can't do that if we just say, like, I converted to a certain idea today, and I'm never gonna study that idea ever again. I figured out that problem. That's not how this works. All right? Keep engaging in solving the problems. Keep engaging with, people, let's say, I don't know, let's say you're a Democrat today. It's like, keep reading those Republican books that come out, right? You're a Republican today. It's like, keep reading the Democrat arguments for, I don't know, pro-choice, right? Or stricter gun laws, right? Or whatever it is. It's like, keep reading the other side of the issue because you want to grow in your own beliefs, and you also want to be open to the fact that it's like, one day you might be found out. It's like, I've been believing the wrong thing. Final slide here. John Stuart Mill's final point is that they're in conflicting doctrine. So in two people are debating, they might share a truth between them, right? So first and foremost, it's like the other person might be right. The second point is like, you might be correct, but if you don't study the other ideas, you don't really actually know why you're correct. This point is like, both you and your opponent might be correct. So this is how I love this way. I love this method because this is what Socrates this is what he advocated for. Socrates didn't like debates as they were being taught because debates are two people argue and one person wins and one person loses. And Socrates says that's not how we should be solving problems. A debate shouldn't be one person wins and one person loses. A debate should be two intelligent people with different ideas come into the arena and they both argue and they're strengthening each other's arguments. And at the end of it, we're going to find some sort of third space up here where both of them are closer to the truth. So Socrates wasn't about winning and losing. Socrates was about, there's a truth up here and we're just arguing down here trying to figure it out together. So go into a debate arguing with your opponent and saying, look, I'm probably not 100% correct and neither are you, but you and I need to hash this out because the goal is for both of us to get closer to the solution. So I like to think about this, an easy one is on the issue of gun violence. Everybody agrees fewer gun violent deaths is the maximum reward. Like, that's where we need to get. Over here you have a pro-gun guy. Over here you have an anti-gun guy. It's like they should debate, not to sort of win the argument, guns are good, guns are bad. They should be debating in a direction of like, how can we both get closer to this idea of fewer gun deaths? All right? That's how you need to go. Even if you're, even if you're 90% correct, your opponent still has like 10% and you need that. So it's like, that's the attitude that you should go on. It's like, hey, help me figure out the rest of my problem. Sometimes I might, quote unquote, know that I'm correct, but I can't really figure out why. So I'm going to listen to the opposition in order to help me get there. This is a cool little trick, or a cool little thing. Not a cool thing. It's a kind of an annoying thing. But I tell my students is, when it comes to academic writing and publishing, let's say that I have to write a 20-page paper for an upcoming book chapter, right? This is what I tell my students. When I write a 20-page paper, I actually probably produce 40 pages of material. But I had to produce that 40 pages of material in order to figure out what I actually meant in 20 pages. So this helps you navigate by sort of going through all the mess of like, I'm right, I'm wrong, I'm taking a weird turn here, I don't really know what's going on. But the fact that I'm just sort of like getting out all of my ideas and I'm talking myself through it, and I'm reading people who disagree with me and they're giving me some ideas, I'm going back. All of a sudden I get to page 40 and I look back on page 16 and I'm like, wow, page 16 was real messed up. But I had to do page 16 in order to sort of get my way to page 40 and realize that page 16 is wrong, right? So that's what we're doing in a debate here, right? I know that my conclusion is correct. I just don't know how I got there, so I need to go and I need to consume all the information. And finally, what is the only thing in history that has stood between differing opinions and violence, which I think is a really important notion of On Liberty here with John Stuart Mill? And the answer is speaking, arguing, and words. That's the only buffer that we have, as human beings, have ever found between violent conflict and, and differing opinions. So two people, it's just like two people going to like, I disagree with you. We can do two things. It's like we can start throwing punches, right? Or we can start arguing with each other. And sometimes those words are going to be mean and nasty, and we're going to say things that, aren't polite. But again, as I mentioned in the Constitution PowerPoint, it's like I'd rather have someone say an impolite thing to me than punch me in the face. All right? So this is why free speech is important, right? Without free speech, without allowing your opposition to speak freely, we're going to default to physical force, right? When solving disputes. Okay? And this is a little quote that I kind of came up with a few years back as I was sort of thinking through some of these issues, right? When someone was asking me like, why do I support free speech? And I was like, I don't really know. Why do I? And here's my response to them, right? So why do I support free speech? Via resisting censorship and compulsion. Compulsion being someone's forcing me to speak, right? All right. And it's because in the history of people, there have only been two ways of solving conflict: physical violence and rigorous debate. And if you restrain the latter, you're left with the former. If I tell people you cannot speak freely and they really have something to say, they're going to get it done, right? And so I'd rather open the floodgates of speech as opposed to restraining all that speech, and then we end up in some sort of, we're still going to have a conflict. It's just whether or not that conflict is going to come out as a civilized debate or if that conflict is going to come out as physical violence, all right? So these are the three main points of the all-1 packet that Heterodox Academy put out. But again, it's based off of Chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill on Liberty. That's all I have. Thanks for listening, and I will put up a lecture for the next time. All right, see you later.